Man's contact with the Antarctic goes back only 150 years. The icy continent lay unknown and unvisited while man took possession of and exploited the rest of his world. Today, this sanctuary of science remains Earth's last Eden.
We came across 3 penguins down here too.
Every year, hundreds of scientists and technicians from over a dozen countries come down to Antarctica to probe into its secrets. Their findings are free to all, and volumes of results have been published. But it's a fair bet that most of us would find them hard going. Probably even the purpose of some of the work would seem a bit obscure. Heading this project is New Zealand geologist Peter Barrett.
We're drilling to find out the age of the East Antarctic ice sheet. We're actually drilling offshore to do this because the glaciers in Antarctica have been eroding and scraping away at the continent for millions of years now and have left no record of this except offshore. The importance of the drilling to me really relates to the history of the Antarctic ice sheet, which is a feature that dominates world climate.
Few of us can follow how tiny bits of evidence collected from the rocks can tell us much about the world's climate. It's much easier to understand science if there's a tangible end product.
There's been a lot of interest from the public in our drilling project, I think chiefly because people associate with drilling with oil and gas. And it's certainly true that oil companies are showing a considerable interest in the Ross Sea region, that the Antarctic treaty nations are very concerned about the possibilities for development and how it might be controlled. But this is not what we're drilling for. In fact, oil and gas is not the purpose of the project, but in spite of that, it's clear that if we do find gas, it's bound to bring the day closer when Antarctica is exploited for its mineral resources.
And that is the dilemma for the scientists. For 25 years, they've had Antarctica to themselves. It's been an unspoiled paradise where they've been able to seek knowledge free from political or commercial pressures. But the knowledge they're gaining is bringing its own dangers. Others may use it and wreck the paradise. There's hardly a scientist who has actually been there who wants to see that happen.
I do hope that they do not find oil down here, because development of such a resource would really disturb delicate Antarctic ecosystems.
I hate to see Antarctica being despoiled. I really feel that we should make every endeavour to maintain the old attitude that Antarctica is a continent for science. We've moved away somewhat from that, but I'm pleased to say that I still think that the wonder exists and it's still there in our minds. We still love the place rather than just like it.
We think of scientists as people who deal in facts. How then can such a barren and harsh place strike such deep chords in their souls? But from the earliest days of man in Antarctica, the continent has had profound and sometimes contradictory effects on its visitors. How strange it all is, wrote Captain Scott. For countless ages, the great sombre mountains above us have loomed through the gloomy polar night, with never an eye to mark their grandeur. But James Clark Ross, who 70 years earlier was the first man to see the same mountains and the ice shelf which bears his name, saw them with feelings of indescribable delight. To Ross, the view, whilst attracting the admiration and delighting the eye, could not fail also to improve the mind. Scott thought that after he and his party had left, all must be surrendered again to the desolation of the ages. For a while, it was. But now, man is back, and clearly he's here to stay. But like Ross 140 years ago, he finds it difficult to describe his feelings about it.
I've been used to being in the snow back home, but down here it's completely different in that it's just out of this world, really. I don't think anyone who hasn't been down to Antarctica could imagine what it would be like.
Those of us that work there are never very clear as to just how much of our fascination with our work in Antarctica is due to the place and how much is due to the science. Perhaps we're still in our childhood looking for challenges to overcome, like seeing a log across the stream, see if you can get over it without falling in. I think there's quite an element of that sort of thing. It's also true of the science. There are similar sorts of challenges there. But also, it may be because Antarctic problems are often global problems.
God, silence is golden. Okay.
The idea of looking in the Antarctic for solutions to world problems may be new. But the enjoyment, the simple pleasure of meeting the challenges of a demanding environment isn't.
It's the uphill runner keel or the downhill runner?
The early explorers would immediately recognize the scene of a field party making camp today, probably even to the taste of the food.
But it must have been a hell of a life up there.
The rhythms and problems of living in the bases haven't changed all that much either.
Compared to living in a polar tent, probably not.
It was supposed to be at the time the most advanced hut in the Antarctic.
Living conditions are not what you call ritzy.
Morning. G'day.
Very crowded. Privacy is very hard to find. Freezing is a continual problem. Frozen hoses, vehicles that won't start, motors that need preheating.
You can't have snow lying around the buildings because it melts and gets inside. You have to sweep the covered ways, otherwise the ice falls down on the footpaths and makes them slippery and you fall over and break your leg. And here we have to put a great deal into the base so that we can live in it.
Not whatever you like. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Come from the sky.
Just use it down. It's your turn now.
During the summer, there are plenty of people to help with the day-to-day chores. But come the winter, and the base will be almost empty. For the winter over crew, the isolation from a normal world will be almost complete.
It's so totally different. It's different in that you're not tied down to the 24-hour day, for example. There's no night, there's no day, and if it weren't for maintaining contacts with the outside world, you would simply drift into a totally different pattern of sleep and work.
Yeah, Roger, Graham. I'll give them a ring and see if I can find that out for you. I don't give you much hope.
Imagine a world where there was no radio to listen to the news, no television to watch, no newspaper, and you're left in limbo. People cause problems, and unless everyone gets on with each other extremely well, you can end up with all sorts of major problems arising out of very minor little incidents.
The arrival of spring brings some of the worst storms of the year. For the winter over crew, life accelerates again as they prepare for the arrival of the new season's personnel. And then it's time. After 6 long months, the first plane arrives, bringing with it a new group of people to experience Antarctica's special qualities. Another season of work will begin, during which scientists from many countries will work together in peaceful accord, jointly pursuing and freely exchanging ideas and results. It's so distant and so different from the rest of our world.
Left turn to 270 and course is gone across. I don't have it yet. Straight off the nose there.
A world away, literally, the Arctic is a war zone.
Yeah, I'll keep the speed up just a bit more.
Unlike Antarctica, the Arctic air is thick with the icy probing fingers of suspicion. In the event of conflict, the Arctic will be a battleground. Today, around and above it, 2 superpowers test each other's strength. It seems even more than a world away from how they meet at the other end of the Earth. Suspicion is replaced by smiles, secrecy by exchanges of scientists. Confrontation turns into cooperation under a treaty that is unique in the history of international dealings concerning territory. But there are growing problems. The work is coordinated by the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, or SCAR. At its 1980 meeting, the president, George Knox, was already warning of new pressures.
This meeting is an important one for SCAR, and a number of important issues are to be discussed. The future role and structure of SCAR, the SCAR response to the rapidly developing requirements for resource-related research, and in particular, the potential environmental impact of future mineral exploration and exploitation. We've lived through the era of pioneer scientific exploration in Antarctica. We're now approaching the era in which economic and consequently political interests may tend to dominate Antarctic research activities.
But these people are only scientists. Their recommendations don't necessarily carry a lot of weight with the politicians who have to make the decisions. They're not unaware of other priorities, but many of them feel they have a special responsibility because of their privileged position. Peter Barrett explains.
So I think it's a feature of Antarctic scientists that they have acquired over a relatively few years of work there, a sympathy for the Antarctic environment, which I would not really expect from people who haven't worked there. And I think this makes Antarctic scientists almost unusual among world scientists in other areas because there is virtually no other group of people that can speak for the Antarctic or represent it. It doesn't have any other population.
Even the Arctic has that. In the far north of America, there's an ancient people, the Eskimos. Perhaps their small numbers and primitive lifestyle don't qualify them for a lot of political attention. They're of interest mainly to the anthropologists, who are intrigued by a people that build their shelter out of snow, light and heat it with seal oil, and get their bedding and clothing from seal skins. There aren't many societies left who rely so simply on their immediate environment. It's fascinating still to be able to see such traces of a way of life that has changed so little since the very earliest days of man the hunter. On the other side of the Arctic, in northern Europe, there's another system. Not quite as old, but equally as interesting. At summer's end, driven by an ages-old instinct, the reindeer gather for the autumn migration. The Laplander's economy is not a hunting one, but nor is it agricultural. Although some animals will be castrated to make them calmer while pulling sledges, the Lapps have not truly domesticated the reindeer. They simply follow the herds as they move between their seasonal feeding grounds. Both sides benefit. Man helps the deer find food in harsh winters and looks after their health and well-being. And the deer provide food, shelter and clothing for man. It's a harmonious system, far from the aircraft and icebreakers that man needs in the Antarctic. But even here, modern technology is intruding. Instead of swimming the fjord, the herd will cross by ferry. New sounds in an ancient wilderness, and new people too, for the ferry is laid on by the military. Over in Alaska, the military have been joined by big business. In the last 25 years, the economics of energy have changed out of all recognition. They've forced the development of a cold weather oil technology. If demand continues to grow and prices to soar, it's almost inevitable that these Arctic scenes will be repeated in the Antarctic. Here, technology and politics had to take into account the needs and sensitivities of an indigenous people. To speak for the Antarctic, there are only its visitors, the scientists.
The problem I see arising is that in the near future we're likely to have a 100-fold increase in human activity in the Antarctic, and this activity may be of a very different character from the scientific activity that's taken place. I also think they will want results quickly because the criterion will be the economics of the operation. And I see this as a significant threat to the Antarctic environment.
These days, we appreciate the effects of pollution, and it's easy to understand how exaggerated the problems might be in such a sensitive environment. But are there other moral issues if Antarctica is to be exploited? Certainly there are some who see the way the treaty is presently operating as a kind of exclusive club, with membership confined to the wealthy developed nations. If Antarctica is truly international, it would be nice to think that any benefits from it will go to the millions who really need them. But they're the very people who cannot afford the high costs of exploitation. These are political questions and will have to be decided by the politicians. For the moment, the scientists can only advise and warn.
I'm forced to the conclusion that exploitation is likely to take place in the foreseeable future. And given that, then my concern is that it be done in the most rigorous fashion. There are two areas that I see that we should be concerned about. One is the biological environment, not so much the immediate impact of spills, but the gradual increase in levels of oil in the Southern Ocean as a consequence of development over many years. The other area is in the effect on the Antarctic ice sheet and on the climate of Antarctica. The Antarctic is, in fact, quite a fragile place.
Until recently, we wouldn't have used the word fragile to describe huge ice sheets and high mountains. But if science is telling us anything these days, it is that very small triggers can set off very large changes. We've learnt much about the lonely continent, how sensitively its whole environment is poised, not just affecting our part of the world, but being affected by it. With only a short time still to run, the Antarctic Treaty is being subjected to familiar strains. And yet, it isn't easy to strike a balance between the time and expense of being careful and the pressing needs of distant but burgeoning societies. It was an accident of geography that isolated Antarctica from man for so long, and so far we've treated it with a kind of respect we haven't shown much elsewhere in our world. It's our last Garden of Eden, the only remaining part of our world that we haven't yet used or abused. In it, our scientists have been cultivating the tree of knowledge. But it is we, all mankind, who will eat of its fruits.